there's a quiet fear that hides behind your smile. The fear that if people really saw you, not the version you've learned to perform, but the raw, unfiltered you, they might step back. It's the kind of fear that doesn't scream. It hums softly under every decision, every word you edit before it leaves your mouth. You've learned to read a room before you even walk into it. You know what's expected. You know how to shrink into the outline of approval. That's how most of us survive childhood, by becoming what keeps the peace. When love is uncertain, we trade authenticity for belonging. And at first, it feels like safety. You notice which parts of you are praised, and you repeat them. You notice which parts are met with silence, and you bury them. You become fluent in adaptation, fluent in pleasing, in performing, in pretending to not need as much as you actually do. But somewhere in that learning, something small inside you went quiet. That quiet part was your real voice, not the one that earns nods, but the one that trembles when it speaks truth. And when that voice went silent, you started to feel distant from your own life, even when everything looked fine from the outside. People think losing yourself happens in one dramatic moment, but it happens slowly. In every small decision to smile when you want to cry, to agree when you disagree, to stay quiet when your body is begging to speak. Over time, that silence becomes identity. You forget where the mask ends, and you begin. If this feels familiar, stay with me, because the real you isn't lost, just buried under layers of protection that once kept you safe. Here's the thing most people don't realize. Pretending doesn't always come from vanity. It often comes from love, the desire not to hurt others, not to disrupt, not to disappoint. You learned to manage everyone's comfort except your own. And now your mind runs on loops of self-editing, asking, "Is this too much?" before you even speak. When you live like that long enough, you begin to confuse peace with absence of conflict. You think being unseen is easier than being misunderstood. You start to shrink, not because you want to disappear, but because you're tired of defending what feels too fragile to show. The fear of being yourself is never really about yourself. It's about what the world might do with the truth. Will they leave? Will they judge? Will they finally say what you secretly believe, that you're too much or not enough? So you hold it all in, convincing yourself that control equals safety. But control is just another kind of cage, gold-plated, familiar, but still a cage. Sometimes, people who fear being themselves are actually the ones who feel the most deeply. They've seen what happens when emotion explodes in the wrong place. They've learned that softness can invite pain. So they lock their softness away, mistaking numbness for strength. Yet deep down, the body remembers authenticity like a scent. It knows when you're performing. That's why even small moments of honesty feel like oxygen, a breath you didn't realize you were missing. You say something real, and for a second, you feel free. But then the old fear rushes back. What if that freedom costs connection? What if honesty leads to loneliness? That's the paradox of the human heart. We crave both truth and safety, but one often feels like it cancels the other. So we build half-lives, curated, controlled, manageable. But no matter how well you perform, the ache doesn't disappear, because your soul doesn't want comfort. It wants contact. And maybe that's why you're here, listening, reading, searching, because something in you already knows. The mask is heavy, and you're tired of carrying it. But how do you even begin to take it off when it's been your face for so long? How do you show the world who you are when you're still figuring that out yourself? It begins not with performance, but with permission. Permission to be unsure, to be messy, to want, to tremble. You don't have to announce your truth. You can whisper it. You don't have to destroy the mask in one grand act. You can peel it back, gently, in moments of safety. Because authenticity isn't rebellion. It's remembrance. It's remembering who you were before you learned who to be. And yet, here's the hard part. The moment you start being real, not everyone will clap. Some will miss the version of you that made them comfortable. Some will call it change when it's actually return. That will hurt. Deeply. Because the fear was right about one thing. Authenticity can cost relationships. But the ones that survive, they'll finally love you, not the idea of you. Still, the question lingers. If authenticity risks loss, is it worth it? That's what we'll explore next. The hardest part of becoming yourself isn't self-expression. It's self-trust. You can't reveal what you don't yet believe is worthy of being seen. And most people don't lack courage. They lack inner permission to take up emotional space. Think about how early that starts. Maybe you grew up around people who made your emotions feel inconvenient. When you cried, they told you to toughen up. When you were excited, they told you to calm down. When you disagreed, they called you ungrateful. So you learned that expression equals risk, and silence equals survival. That kind of conditioning doesn't fade with age. It disguises itself as personality. You start calling your fear of conflict being easygoing. You call your exhaustion being independent. You call your inability to say no being kind. And everyone applauds those traits, not realizing they're symptoms of self-abandonment. There's a difference between peace and compliance. Peace comes from alignment. Compliance comes from fear. But when fear has been your compass for years, peace can feel like guilt, because you're no longer earning your safety by pleasing others. That's the silent war authenticity wages inside us. Part of you wants to be free. Another part whispers that freedom is dangerous. So you oscillate, bold one day, apologetic the next. You reveal a little, then retreat. You test if the world can handle your truth. And sometimes it can't. And that confirms your fear. But what if those rejections weren't proof that you're too much? What if they're proof that you've outgrown rooms built for smaller versions of you? Every time you betray yourself to stay liked, something in you disconnects. And that disconnection becomes a quiet grief. The grief of not being met. You can't fully feel loved when you're not fully seen. Because even when people say they love you, the question echoes, would they still love me if they knew all of me? That's why so many people live half-loved. They accept conditional affection, because unconditional love feels mythical. But here's the truth most never realize. Unconditional love doesn't start from others. It begins when you stop demanding conditions from yourself. When you stop saying, I'll be enough when. When you stop editing your identity to fit the story you think will make you worthy. You can't be both hidden and healed. At some point, You have to decide whether safety is worth the slow suffocation of the soul. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not becoming fearless, but learning to live gently beside the fear, without letting it run your life. The moment you stop fighting who you are, life stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like presence. You laugh differently. You breathe deeper. Even silence feels safer, because it's no longer filled with self-judgment. But that peace doesn't come overnight. It comes in micro moments. When you say no without explaining, when you share an unpopular truth and survive the silence afterward. It comes when you realize that being misunderstood doesn't mean you did something wrong. It just means you're finally being seen clearly. And in that clarity, something miraculous happens. You start recognizing other people who are still hiding. You hear their careful words, see the slight hesitation before they speak. You start understanding their masks, because you wore them too. That recognition is empathy, and it's what turns authenticity into connection. Because the point of being yourself isn't rebellion, it's reunion. Reunion with your own voice, your own pace, your own quiet knowing. It's the slow return to the version of you that never needed to be impressive, only honest. And yet, even as you grow into that, a question remains. If you stop performing, who are you underneath the applause? Who are you when no one's watching to approve? That's where the real becoming begins. The self that hides isn't fake. It's just tired. Tired of being on guard. Tired of waiting for permission to exist without adjustment. And somewhere inside you, there's a younger version who's still waiting to be told, it's safe now. You can come out. When you start listening to that younger self, not to fix them, but to understand them, you begin to rewrite the script. You realize your fear wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. It protected you when you had no choice. But what protected you then is now preventing you from being here now. Most people try to find themselves by chasing experiences, travel, goals, identities. But you don't find yourself out there. You meet yourself when you stop running from the parts you abandoned, when you let grief and joy share the same room, when you stop needing to be extraordinary to justify existing. That's when authenticity becomes peace, not performance. Because the self you've been scared to be was never waiting for the world to approve. It was waiting for you to choose it. And choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's the only way to love truthfully. You can't love others honestly while lying to yourself. Every real connection depends on two people who are willing to be seen, imperfectly, awkwardly, completely. So you start small. You stop over-explaining your feelings. You stop apologizing for having needs. You stop mistaking agreement for harmony. And slowly, you begin to feel the ground beneath you. Solid, steady, yours. Because authenticity doesn't guarantee ease. It guarantees alignment. You might lose comfort, but you gain clarity. You might lose approval, but you gain peace. And peace that costs performance is never peace at all. It's postponement. You've spent years learning how to belong. Now you're learning how to be. And being, truly being, means letting life touch you without filtering it through fear. The world doesn't need another perfect person. It needs someone willing to be real enough to remind others what being alive feels like. And maybe that's your quiet purpose. Not to impress, not to perform, but to be the evidence that authenticity survives fear. That softness doesn't mean weakness. That truth doesn't destroy connection. It deepens it. So when the old fear whispers, "It's safer to hide," you can whisper back, "I know." But safety isn't the same as living. And from that whisper, something begins again. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady. A life that finally feels like yours. Not because the fear is gone, but because you no longer need to hide to be loved. And maybe that's all becoming yourself ever really meant. Not arriving somewhere new, but coming home to what was true all along. There's something sacred about the moment after the healing. The quiet that comes when you've stopped performing, but haven't yet learned how to rest. You stand in this in-between. Not who you were, not yet who you're becoming. And the silence feels both beautiful and terrifying. Because when the noise of pretending fades, you start hearing everything you used to drown out. Your real thoughts, your real desires, your real loneliness. And it's there, in that quiet reckoning, that authenticity begins to deepen from idea into embodiment. Most people think becoming yourself ends with courage, but it really begins with care. Courage is what lets you step into the truth. Care is what teaches you how to stay there. Because after you've stripped away the false layers, what remains is tenderness. And tenderness needs gentleness to survive. You start realizing that honesty isn't a single act. It's a daily practice of returning. Returning to what's real after every moment of doubt, after every small relapse into performance. You'll catch yourself saying what people want to hear again, and that's okay. Authenticity isn't perfection. It's forgiveness. It's saying, "I lost myself for a second," and then choosing to come back. There's also grief in this stage, not just for who you pretended to be, but for the years you spent pretending. You'll grieve the time you wasted on silence, on self-erasure, on trying to be palatable. You'll realize how many connections were built on false peace, but that grief is proof that you're no longer numb. It's the ache of someone who finally feels again. You begin to see that being yourself doesn't always mean being understood. Sometimes it means being misread, misjudged, or even rejected. And yet, rejection starts to lose its sting because you recognize it as redirection, life's way of filtering out what can't meet your truth. You start thanking what leaves, because every goodbye creates space for something aligned to arrive. Soon, authenticity becomes less about what you reveal to others and more about how honestly you meet yourself. You start noticing the subtle ways you self-betray, the small compromises, the swallowed words, the delayed rest. And you begin correcting them, gently, not out of shame, but out of loyalty. You treat your truth like a living thing that deserves protection, not performance. That's when your presence changes. People feel it, not because you speak louder, but because you exist clearer. You walk into rooms without needing to shrink or expand to fit. You stop scanning for approval because you already carry your own. And that quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't demand to be seen, becomes magnetic. You'll start attracting people who breathe the same kind of honesty. They won't need you to edit your sentences or explain your feelings twice. With them, silence will feel full. Because real connection doesn't come from performance. It comes from resonance. Two people vibrating at the frequency of truth, not fear. But even as that happens, you'll still have moments of doubt. You'll wonder if you've gone too far, if you're being selfish, if you should soften your truth to stay accepted. And in those moments, remember, self-abandonment is not humility. There's nothing holy about shrinking so others can feel comfortable. The world doesn't heal through your silence. It heals through your sincerity. You'll also notice that authenticity changes your relationship with time. When you stop performing, life slows down. You start moving at the pace of presence, not pressure. You savor instead of chase. You listen instead of plan your next answer. And in that stillness, you realize this is what aliveness actually feels like. You no longer measure your worth by productivity or praise. You measure it by peace, by how softly you can sit inside yourself without needing to escape. And that peace doesn't depend on who stays or goes, what you achieve or fail. It's an inner steadiness that says, even here, even now, I am enough. That's the paradox. You spent years trying to be enough for others, only to realize you always were, just never for yourself. You don't earn authenticity through effort. You uncover it through surrender. And the moment you stop trying to prove your worth, you start living from it. Sometimes you'll still miss the old mask. It offered certainty, a script to follow, a role to play. Now, life feels unscripted. But maybe that's what makes it sacred, that you finally get to write it as you live it. And maybe, one quiet evening, you'll catch yourself laughing, not because life is perfect, but because you realize you've made peace with imperfection. You'll notice that the fear you built your life around has softened into something else. Awareness. Awareness that fear never truly leaves. It just learns to walk beside courage. You'll look back at the person who once thought authenticity was dangerous and feel nothing but tenderness, because you'll see now that it wasn't fear holding you back. It was longing. Longing to be seen without armor. Longing to rest without pretending. Longing to love and be loved without translation. And maybe that's what being yourself really gives you. Not a louder life, but a truer one. A life that feels like breathing after years of holding it in. A life where even pain feels purposeful, because it doesn't require performance. So when you wake tomorrow and that old fear stirs again, don't fight it. Just remind it, softly, kindly. We're safe now. Then step into the day, unarmored, unedited, uncertain, and alive. Because the world doesn't need the version of you that fits. It needs the version that feels. And somewhere, someone is waiting to meet you. Not the one you've been rehearsing, but the one you've finally remembered. That's where the story keeps unfolding. Not in endings, but in the quiet, trembling beginnings of being real again.